Elisha Wiesel is a recovering Wall Street executive who went on to serve as the technology lead for digital marketing in the Mike Bloomberg presidential campaign. Through his board service with Good Shepherd Services, he raised millions of dollars for New York's neediest by convening Midnight Madness, inspiring hundreds of finance professionals to stay up all night solving elaborate puzzles on the city streets. When his father, Elie Wiesel, passed away, Elisha realized that many others missed his voice, and so when opportunities for impact arise, he shares his father's message and continues his legacy by standing up for persecuted communities. Elisha is in the process of rebooting the Elie Wiesel Foundation. Joining Elisha today is Moment Editor-in-Chief Nadine Epstein. Nadine is the editor of the book Elie Wiesel, An Extraordinary Life and Legacy. Please welcome Elisha Wiesel and Nadine Epstein.
Welcome, Elisha. We're so excited to be honoring you this year at Moment's 50th anniversary gala. You've been part of the Moment family since you were 3 years old or something like that, when your father and Leonard Fine started Moment. That in 1975, this is our 50th year. I was wondering if you know the story of why they named the magazine Moment.
I would love to hear the origin story of Moment, but also maybe the origin story of your involvement in it too.
Well, first, there was another Moment. It was called Der Moment, and it was started in 1910 in Warsaw, and it was a Yiddish daily, and it was probably the most popular newspaper in Eastern Europe. And and it was an independent newspaper, which is really fascinating. And your grandfather, your dad's father, read the newspaper every day at the kitchen table. And your dad, who was very religious, more religious than your grandfather, didn't actually read the paper, but he always admired watching your grandfather read the paper. And then later on, when he decided he really wanted to be a writer and a journalist, he remembered Der Moment, and he and Leonard Fine decided that they would name Moment for this newspaper. And in 1939, when the Nazis came into Warsaw, the newspaper was shut down, and eventually many of its editors were killed. So this is kind of the rebirth of Moment for the modern era.
I love it. My father also has a quote he would often say, which is that life is measured not in years, but in moments.
Oh, that's a wonderful quote. I'll remember that. Um, and for me, I became involved in Moment in 2003 and ended up taking it over in 2004. And that's when I went to meet your dad for the first time at Boston University in his beautiful office there. And he was so wonderful and so supportive and so welcoming, and said, as he always did every time I saw him, "What can I do for you?" Which I always found to be the most meaningful greeting. Very wonderful, because it was a big endeavor to take over Moment. And
My bracha for you in Rosh Hashanah, Nadine, is that all of your future donors should greet you with that message.
it was very special. And all the way through, he was very supportive. And he told me that, Moment had become what he always wanted it to be. And he wanted me to be very proud of that. So
That's terrific. Listen, it's not unusual in the sense that my father often had his door open for people who were looking to build and create new things. My father did lend his name to quite a few of them, but I know he was proud of Moment. And I will say, like, they didn't always work out. So I'm thrilled that this one actually came to fruition and became something that my father would have been proud of.
Well, he was proud of it, and he loved the evolution of it. And he always told me that um, he loved the tumult was my favorite word, tumult of Jewish thought, and that Moment captured that. And that's one of the things that was so important to him. And he also loved that I was a young woman taking over Moment, and
Mhm.
that was very cool. He was that was pretty rare, because I was definitely the first woman. So, well, your dad was a journalist for many years, although by the time you came along, I think he was writing books and he'd begun teaching, and soon after he was leading the effort to create a Holocaust memorial and a museum. Did he ever talk to you much about his journalism work? Did you ever even view him as a journalist?
It's a great question. My early moments are, as you said, of the creation of the Holocaust Memorial Council, sitting on Jimmy Carter's lap, President Carter's lap, in the rotunda, understanding that there was a lot of tension. My father was asking for things, and President Carter wasn't so sure, and then of course going on international trips to Poland. Of course, also the Soviet Jewry movement, but journalists not so much. I really only discovered later in life when friends started sending me translated articles from their forward of my father going to Disneyland and putting together these incredible reviews of Disneyland, American culture. I have great discoveries, but I don't remember that as a young person.
Well, of course, he was a correspondent, I think, for
Are
at
you
least
idiot?
for Idiot,
Yeah,
in first of all, in the UN. And so he wrote many stories and many news stories. And before that, he was writing in France, and then even went on an Israeli reporting trip.
of course. And like every journalist, he had to develop sources. And one of the sources that became much more than a source was Golda Meir at the UN, who really took him under her wing and sheltered him, gave him food. He was a starving journalist, and he was collecting soap bars from the UN's bathroom, so he didn't have to go buy soap for his home. So that was a very important time in his life.
Yes. Do you have some of these articles? We should probably work on putting together some of them because it'd be really interesting to look at that part of his career.
So there forwards, there are a number of translated articles. We've sort of done them sporadically as we found interesting things, but we don't have the complete collection of translated things back from Der Forwards or from Yediot. But I agree, that's a worthwhile thing for us to consider in our archives. And hopefully now is possible. We've been staffing up the foundation. We have a number of strategic partnerships in place. The sort of project we'd love to do.
So, what was it like? We've spoken about this a little bit before, but I want to know, what was it like to grow up in the Wiesel family, being the son of Elie and Marion, two very outspoken and strong people?
You might have to be more specific because that's there's a huge, we could talk about anything.
Okay, well, let's start with your dad.
Okay. My father was a very loving father. He, interestingly enough, I think tried to shield me from a lot of his burden. I, remember sitting on his lap one time when he was at his typewriter, maybe like 4 or 5 years old, asking him questions about the number on his arm. What is the house in that photograph that he kept above his typewriter, no matter where he wrote, which was, of course, Siget, his childhood home. Did I have grandparents? Why didn't I have grandparents? And, to his credit, I think he really wanted to let me have the most normal American childhood that one could have. Now, that said, I had to teach him how to throw a baseball. He didn't know a lot of the things that were useful for an American child at the time. So I was always, like, is my father kind of as connected to this world that I'm growing up in? It wasn't always so clear to me, but he was a loving father, a devoted father, and someone I appreciated in that capacity more and more later in life.
Um, I guess, was there something that your father did ask you, though?
I'm not sure if that's a leading question. Is there something you have in mind?
Well, it is a leading question. What were the things? So your dad was very supportive of you, gave you a lot of unconditional love, but
Yeah.
were there things that he really wanted from you?
Yeah, these were things that, we're talking about childhood. I mean, when I became a young adult, he became very clear that there were certain boundaries. For example, he wanted me to marry Jewish. He didn't care if this was an Ethiopian convert or Sephardi or Mizrahi. He couldn't have cared less, but he wanted Jewish grandchildren, and he felt that that was extremely important. And later, much later in life, closer to his end, he asked me to say Kaddish for him on a daily basis at shul, which was not something I'd been planning on doing. It really did require an ask on his part. And I think I've mentioned to you in the past, I had thought that, this would be the last favor that I could do for him. But of course, it turned out this was him doing a last favor for me in reconnecting me to the Jewish community.
Well, that brings me to the role of Judaism in your life since you were a child. I mean, has this changed?
Yeah, I think that the role of Judaism in my life when I was a child, I think was a very sort of naive, conception of Judaism. I mean, I went to an Orthodox yeshiva for 14 years. And I think when I was pre-bar mitzvah age, a lot of things were just sort of articles of faith, as they were laid out. This concept that, I was really being judged minute by minute, that I was accountable for my actions. Um, I think I went through a period where Judaism was kind of not so important in my life. I remember having a screaming argument with my father, my God, on all things on Yom Kippur, in my late teens, screaming at the top of my lungs that I'd rather be a Buddhist, I'd rather be anything than Jewish. It's such a pain in the ass. Why would I want to be Jewish? And I must say that later in life, I've really come to appreciate how important it is to be part of a people. And my father's phrasing was always interesting. It wasn't a question of God necessarily. It was more a question of the value of the traditions themselves. He had one great thing he was always saying, which is, you know, um, God and I may have arguments, we may disagree, but why should I take it out on Shabbos? He always felt that the most important commandment or instruction was, not to separate from the community, not to be apart from it. So these were things that were very important to him. And as I, I'm getting a little bit more perspective, a little more gray in my beard, not that I have much black left, I appreciate it much more.
Well, how has this re-embrace of Judaism changed you and changed your life?
I don't know. I'm so afraid of sounding like a religious zealot. It's foundational. I think that to be part of a culture that goes back thousands of years, to feel that I'm in dialogue constantly with what my father and grandfather and their parents, all the way back, that there were traditions and rituals that they were shaping and embracing, that I'm reading the Talmud every day, which is a dialogue across all those generations, in the margins, so to speak, and quite literally. It's very profound because it gives me a sense that we can pass on values and knowledge and a conversation with generations yet to come. And it's a very comforting thing because it makes one feel that one is part of something that is bigger than oneself, not just across people and the tribe as it exists today, but also across time. And that's very, very powerful. It's also pressure and responsibility because it means that the decisions that we're making today are very profound. Are we going to choose to continue the line? Are we going to have more generations of Jews that come from our name, our blood? What are we adding to this thing as opposed to, merely making this profound decision of to continue or to not continue? Well, how about what to add to it? Find new ways to bring us closer together, find new perspectives. So I think it's a comforting thing, but it comes with its own set of pressures as well.
I'm actually reading Daniel Deronda by George Eliot. I don't know if you've ever read it.
Are you kidding me? That was my favorite book this summer. I just read Daniel Deronda 2 months ago, and it blew my friggin' mind. I cannot believe it. First of all, George Eliot, having to write as a man because nobody would read what a woman had to write in 1850s England. Second, not a Jew. And oh my God, this amazing Zionist story. And as somebody who loved Virginia Woolf, seeing the seeds of Virginia Woolf's writing and the way George Eliot writes, this was my favorite book of the summer. I'm so glad you're reading it.
And so just last night, I'm reading this section about Mordecai, and they're at the philosophers meeting in London, and really they're talking about the whole, exactly what you're talking about, what you're saying, whether, Judaism should be how to be Jewish, and what does it mean, and and Mordecai, and I haven't finished the book, so I don't know what's.
Okay, I won't give you any spoilers.
But I mean, I'm to why while you're saying this, I'm smiling because I feel like I just heard Mordecai say some of this.
I've been underlining like crazy in that book, but I will tell you something. I usually, for a great book like that, I read the book, then I go back to the forward.
Mhm.
Not the forwards as in the Yiddish publication, but the actual forward to the book. And one of the things that just made me be like, of course, but of course, is the forward is written by some academic as it's republished in the Penguin Classics, and the forward writer is just scratching their head. Why in the world George Eliot would have decided to honor the Israeli state, the nascent Israeli state with all of the terrible things that, Israel would end up doing. Oh, the shame, the shame. But yet George Eliot is a great writer, so we have to read this anyway. It's just like, oh my God. And like, there comes the world right on cue with its complete inability to understand Judaism. And just, I don't know. I thought it was just in some sense a perfect framing of this wonderful book.
I did actually peruse the forward first.
Did you
And
have the same reaction that I did?
it just I didn't know what the book was going to be, but I felt like I felt also it didn't really get to the depth of the book. And I mean
No.
whatever, I felt uncomfortable with it.
The
So
forward writer was clearly uncomfortable that a
yeah.
great writer in the 1850s had chosen to stand up for Zionism at a
Why
time where like nobody knew what it was.
why would this woman be so interested in this? And and so that was kind of the question that was being asked in the forward.
Because it's an amazing, amazing thing. Judaism, my God, we've survived thousands of years. We've survived everything, and we have continual value to add. And this country that the forward author is, crapping on, is creating medical devices now that save countless lives, is innovating in the economy, is has innovated, and I'm going to say this with some trepidation because I know that, your readership is somewhat mixed on this topic, but actually has created the standard for the most moral army on earth. So I think it's pretty amazing that this book has come out.
I think our readership is very diverse, and I think all the people who read Moment are deeply interested in Judaism and Jewish culture in some way. And there's a lot of space for people to have different opinions and different ideas, and that's one of the things that we're doing at the magazine, and that's really important. So
That's
it's
the, that's the tumult, the authentic tumult.
tumult, and that's what makes it so beautiful. And your dad understood that. And part of my job is just to let the tumult kind of roll on, except in a beautiful and curated and thoughtful manner. And
What
that
crosses a line for you? What have
what
you had to strip out of the magazine because you said, you know what? This goes too far, either one way or the other. Give me a sense without naming names. I'm just curious. What's something that's fallen off?
um I think I have to really think about that question before I answer that more to give you examples. But I do feel like there is a lot of space that we can have this conversation. There's a certain point of anger um, that I don't think we need to add anger and even a lot of self-righteousness into the conversation. It has to be, everything said has to be said in a way that the whole idea of Moment is that someone can read something they disagree with without having it trigger all the dogma that we carry around. And there's dogma on all sides. And there's dogma within, every part of Judaism. There's dogma on the right, there's dogma on the left. And the idea is to not trigger that and to bring you to something new. So it has to be written in the right way. And that takes a lot of effort. And but let me go on and ask you another question
Okay,
here.
but I've got other questions for you. You're not getting off that easy.
You could interview me later. How about that? We'll do.
I got to get some in, that's all.
Happy to be interviewed by you, but maybe let me interview you right now. Um, so your mom died earlier this year, Mary
Mhm.
Wiesel, and she was a powerhouse. She was an amazing woman, and in the film Soul on Fire, you really see her strength. You really see who she is. And she's really, in a way, some of the conscience of the film, I think. It's fascinating. Um, and she wasn't particularly religious, unlike your dad. And she says so in the film. And I'm wondering what, you know, what did she ask of you?
She asked of me to take her cats, which we ended up doing. So we are now a cat owning family, which is very new for us. And we're sort of adapting. We were all highly allergic, yet somehow we're surviving. So that was sort of her big, if you will, deathbed ask, equivalent to my father asking to say Kaddish. So my father wanted Kaddish, my mom wanted cats. Um, I think that in general, her ask really was to be the best version of myself that I could be at any time. My father was probably more concerned with my spiritual development, my connection to the Jewish people. My mother just wanted, she felt that I had some God-given talents, and her business was to be in my business and make sure that those talents were getting adequately used. That was very important for her.
And she did that in the story that we've talked about before, where when you were 9 and you lived in New Jersey, which is where I am right now in Deal. Your mom called my mom, who is executive director of the Jewish Community Center, and asked her, where should I send my son to camp? And my mom said, I just started a computer camp. And she sent you to computer camp. And
It actually, it's a little bit different. The narrative that I remember, which was that there was a JCC, but the only thing that I was really interested in was that there was going to be a computer course at the JCC. And I was the only kid interested in taking a computer class. So they were going to cancel it because an enrollment of one was not enough. They said, we need a minimum enrollment of two. So my mother said, how about I take the class too? So my mom sat next to me and, I'm sure she was miserable, but we were able to get through an initial computer class.
that's a great addition. I think it's the same story, but it's more information that I didn't have. That's wonderful. We'll have to talk about who was the teacher, if you remember.
That I don't remember.
Probably wasn't my father because my father was a physicist and mathematician and he definitely did computers, but I'm sure he was working, but I'm curious who it was. Um, so is there something that your dad has said that you're thinking about, that said to you sometime that you're thinking about now, something that you're seeing in a different light, or that matters more or matters differently?
I spoke at shul about this yesterday, but I've been thinking a lot about one of my father's quotes in Soul on Fire, where he says that effectively God doesn't want us to be unhappy. The surest road to God is through joy and not through tears. And least of all, God dislikes the suffering that we bring upon ourselves. There's a really lovely passage on that. And I was thinking about, this passage that is really the centerpiece of the Rosh Hashanah prayers in the Unetana Tokef, where we talk about Rosh Hashanah yikatevun v'Yom Tzom Kippur yechatemun, that on Rosh Hashanah it's written and on Yom Kippur it's sealed in the book. And it goes on to list all of the different things that are sealed: who will live, who will die, who will complete their years, who will suffer from fire or water or drown or be strangled, who will rise up, who will go down. And I've been thinking a lot about how actually, in this very sort of fanciful way, I think my father was asking, imagine that we have the pen. Assume God wants us to live, and now it's really for us to write the next year that's coming. So how are we going to write it? Are we going to die a little, or are we going to live a little? Are we going to perish in the fire of, angry words? Are we going to pour water on a conversation and drown a friendship? There are many ways to interpret this prayer that, for me, my father's words are a point of departure for.
Well, the world has changed a lot since your dad died 9 years ago, 2016. And I'm wondering, what is it like for you? What's your personal experience right now of being a Jew in America?
You said earlier that, anger is kind of your cutoff point when I was attempting to ask you some questions. And by the way, my father always liked questions better than answers. So, please don't be too shocked if I come back with so many questions. You were saying that anger was one of your cutoffs, that you don't think that there's so much room for anger. And, I attend Kaddish now. I go to Kaddish every day honoring my mother this year, as I did for my father the year that he passed, even though my mother was like, you're not going to do that crazy Kaddish stuff, are you? But of course I am doing it because he would have wanted me to, even if she wouldn't. And we get these, juicy little tidbits from the rabbi who will give, little Devar Torahs, so we can say the rabbi's Kaddish in addition to the mourner's Kaddish. And he's been reading a lot recently from the Rambam, and he was taking us through Hilchos Deos, through Maimonides, and we were going into this whole concept of anger and how anger, it's one of those things you're supposed to stay very, very, very far away from. And by the way, this is all relevant to how I feel today as a Jew living in the United States. And the Rambam goes on to say you should have to stay very far from anger, but there are certain moments where you have to show anger because that's the only way you're going to get through to somebody. And I actually think that that's kind of true. I look at the Black Lives Matter movement and how the Black community decided that after George Floyd, that they were simply not just going to sit still for another Black person under the, booted foot of a police officer, and they didn't just express their opinions articulately in reasoned fashions. They screamed, and the whole world shook. And I think we've been somewhat hesitant to do that as a Jewish community. We get into endless rationalizations, arguing and like defending our little right to exist, as though like that really is allowed to be the question, and as though the premise isn't deeply flawed. And the Rambam says you're allowed to show anger when you need to get through to somebody who won't hear you otherwise, but the anger, interestingly enough, has to be somewhat contrived. If you make a conscious decision to have the anger, but you're not really consumed with anger on the inside, then it's okay. But if you're so consumed with anger on the inside, then it's dangerous. So I thought that that was a very interesting way to think about the world today. Um, do I really, think it's okay what everybody is doing? No, I don't. Do I feel a need sometimes to use an angry tone because I think it's the only way people will listen? Yes, I do. Do I want to walk around carrying that anger within me? No, I feel sadness. I feel betrayal. I feel a lot of things. But sometimes I know that our tone needs to include anger.
So, so how does, so basically you're saying that part of being a Jew in America today for you is that we should be angry to some extent. We should be angry in a controlled fashion.
I think so. I think it I don't know that calm and reason are the only tools in our toolkit. Are they our 99% of the toolkit? Is it what we've relied on? Is it like our brand, so to speak? Yeah, but sometimes I think people need to hear emotion. I don't think that this is a conversation where we can sway hearts and minds on something as important as our right to exist in the state of Israel that can simply be won through common reason. And I know that sounds antithetical and so anti-Elie Wiesel, but I'll tell you the things that have made a difference in my life. When I think about what my children are going to remember, are they going to remember some intellectual argument about why it's important for them to be Jewish and for their kids to be Jewish? No, I think they're going to remember the emotion of a joyful Shabbat dinner table and the songs being sung and how it felt. Do I think somebody talking to me about something as basic as do we have a right to exist in our homeland? Are they going to remember when I point out to them all the deep flaws in their arguments about how the state of Israel was created? Maybe, maybe not. But if they walk away and they realize that this is so existential to me that they cross a line if they threaten the safety and security of my family, I think they might remember that.
I'm not sure when I say when we're creating the conversation that we're taking out all emotion or passion. And passion is very important.
Mhm.
There's a certain there's a certain amount of anger and self-righteousness, I think, that get in the way of understanding. And for me, the goal is understanding. For me, the goal is coming to a place where we can see, I mean, basically what I'm trying to do at Moment is to not pretend that there's simple narratives. And so to be able to dive into the complexity and to do that, you have to be able to have some kind of conversation. You have to set aside at least the anger. So,
Listen, my father was a big believer in listening. He's often misquoted, I find, in these times. I must confess, I've seen signs at rallies that quote my father saying, I'm not indifferent. I stand with the impressed. Silence is never the answer. But that's taken out of context somewhat for a very specific moment in time. My father was upset at how many American Jews in particular were silent during the Shoah, were silent during the Holocaust. And that's true. Indifference is an enemy, but we've almost moved past that in the era of instant information. We've gone from, I think, indifference being the number one enemy, which it was when my father was preaching, so to speak. And I think we're now at the point of indignant ignorance. You use the phrase self-righteousness. Yes, everybody is indignant, and they're indignant based in ignorance. And I think that's a much bigger enemy now than indifference.
well, so that's what we're trying to do. We're trying to fight ignorance. And I would agree with you that the word indifference has been completely co-opted and it no longer means what it once meant. And I see people using it in ways that I find surprising and upsetting. Um, well, you've become very active and vocal in the Jewish community, and which was something that you weren't for most of your life, but especially since your dad has died. I see you out there, you're talking, you're speaking. Do you have a mission? What's your mission?
Mhm. Um, First of all, I felt I didn't need to do that while my father was alive because I felt that he was carrying that message. It was hard to see him in later years be less able to carry that message, and I began to think I might have to do some of this work. The mission is really to uphold my father's values, which is to demonstrate to the world that having a humanitarian lens, believing that there are certain universal things that drive us as human beings, that we can all reach to our best, and these are beautiful ideals, that is not at all incompatible with the particular. The universal and the particular can live side by side. It's not that my father was a human rights activist, and he also happened to be a Jew, and he happened to be a Zionist. These were things were all because of each other. My father felt that he could be the most effective human rights advocate on the world stage if he approached it with the fullness of who he was as a Jew and as a Zionist. And similarly, I think my father would have felt that his Judaism was incomplete if he wasn't playing the biggest role on the world stage, creating change in whatever scope was available to him as a teacher, as a statesman, as a journalist, as a writer, as a father. So I think that that really is my mission is to shake the cognitive dissonance, is to create some cognitive dissonance for all of these people who are, still I think adore the concept of my father. Oh, he wrote Night. Oh, he was, he went after Clinton, to make sure that Bosnia intervention happened. He challenged Reagan on Bitburg. He cared about Rwanda and Darfur. This amazing guy. We love him. Some of those people also think the word Zionist is a bad word, and I want to confront them and create that cognitive dissonance. This man who you respect believed in a strong and secure and safe state of Israel. If that causes you a problem, okay, well, now let's talk about it and understand why my father was the way he was and what he believed.
So how are you doing this? How are you getting that part of the message about across?
Not always easy. I look for opportunities. When, I get platforms, I utilize them. The U.S. Postal Service honored my father with a stamp, just this past week. And, I noticed that on stage, our hosting partner had an American flag, but there was no Israeli flag. And okay, it was sort of a U.S. Postal Service event. But I made sure that we closed the service with Achenu to remember the Chatufim, the hostages, and the Chayalim, the soldiers, exposing and risking their lives right now to try to go into Gaza to save them and to end the war. Um, a couple of years ago, my father was honored at the Washington National Cathedral. And, there was a lot of discussion and tumult, if you will, because I had suggested that Natan Sharansky should be the featured speaker. But, there were concerns because he's from Israel. So I made sure to give the most Zionist speech of my life, when I was platformed there. So some of it is there's a lot of, to figure out how to do this without making my father a one issue person is very important to me. He wasn't just a Zionist, but that's deeply important, particularly in a post October 7th world to understand. And nobody else, I think, is going to carry that banner, so I will.
Well, I just want to stop a second and talk about your work with the Uyghur, because it really moved me that a couple of years ago, you basically focused the foundation on supporting the Uyghur, and the Uyghur being Muslim people living in China who have been living under terrible conditions. And you brought together many different Uyghur from around the world, from the dissident community, the diaspora community of the Uyghur. And I was wondering, why did you choose to focus on the Uyghur? And do you plan to continue this work?
We will for sure remain very connected to that community. We're in the process now of shaping our strategy. We just hired an executive director at the Elie Wiesel Foundation. Her name is Liz Ann Eisen. We're thrilled that she's joined and already is off to the races. And figuring out our human rights platform is definitely one of our priorities. I thought the Uyghur cause was an important cause because my father loved to stand up to the biggest bully on the planet. That's what the Soviet Jewry movement was about. 1965, the Jews of Silence. who could possibly stand up to the USSR as they oppressed the refuseniks, refused to allow emigration to Israel, refused to allow Jewish practice. So I remember with my father going there with a suitcase full of holy books of Sfarim, to share and being chased in the Moscow subway system by KGB. Formative memory for me, age 7 or 8, in the late 70s, early 80s. And in the same way, I think that the Chinese Communist Party today is the biggest actor, unfortunately, of systematic institutional scale oppression. And you see it with what they've done with the Uyghurs. And so I'm a big believer in not being afraid to pick the biggest fight. I also happen to think that the Uyghur cause is one of those where there's the most alignment possibilities across both Democrats and Republicans. There's a good understanding of just how dangerous China is on both sides of the aisle in a world where we agree on so little. So it felt like, who knows, maybe we can actually move the needle a little bit, and I'm still hopeful we will.
So let's go back to anti-Semitism.
Mhm.
How do you define anti-Semitism today? You personally?
How do I define it?
Yeah.
I'm probably less concerned than Ambassador Lipstadt was as to whether there's a hyphen in it or not. I am more concerned.
On that one, I think there's no hyphen anymore.
Right, she got rid of the hyphen. That was an
Done.
applause.
Finish the
No more
hyphen.
hyphen. I'm pretty concerned, I think, with anybody who actively calls for actions that endanger significant numbers of Jewish people. To me, that's what anti-Semitism is. And whether that is right wing or left wing, I couldn't care less. It's anti-Semitism. If somebody calls for things that are dangerous to the 50% of our Jewish brothers and sisters who live in the state of Israel, if you are calling to defund the weapons that Israel needs to stay alive, if you are calling for things that are like a Palestinian state prematurely without any guarantees at all that this will be a safe state to live next to, then you're engaging in my view on anti-Semitism because you are calling for things that are inherently dangerous to a large enough proportion of the Jewish people.
So you live in New York City,
I do.
and there's a fierce debate going on in the Jewish community right now over who should be the next mayor. And I'm wondering where you stand on this.
I'm not going to leave New York if Mamdani wins, which is looking likely from the polls. I think it's terrible if somebody can get elected on a platform that includes strong anti-Israel sentiment. I have a lot of other problems with Mr. Mamdani. I think socialism is an experiment that has been tried. I don't think that the United States will look better if it looks more like Venezuela. What can we do? He sells idealism, and I can't look into anybody's heart. So it's possible he may well believe the things that he believes, and he certainly sells that he believes in those things. And you have a younger generation that is fed up, I think, with the cynicism of politicians who have made all sorts of trade-offs to get where they are and to keep their seats. And they're looking for a breath of fresh air, somebody who's idealistic. Who cares whether or not the suggestions that they have for how government should run are, destined to be failures or not? Who cares whether or not they flirt with hatred of groups like the Jews? You know what? There's some Jews who are like, oh, it just sounds so good, and you know what? I have other people who say free Palestine, so why? Let's just vote for him anyway. I think it's tragic. I think it just highlights the work that we have to do in the Jewish community to educate our children better. And that's all I can say.
Are you concerned about the divisions in the Jewish community? I mean, the community is very divided at this moment.
Of course, I'm concerned. You have a generation that I think chose to not invest in its own Judaism, for whom they were content to let Judaism become a bagel and cream cheese from Zabar's. And when your appreciation of Judaism is reduced purely to a cultural phenomenon, well, it's no huge surprise if then the children of that generation go off to college, are told Israel is evil, and believe it.
So do you have some advice for the American Jewish community right now?
It all depends on where you're starting from. What I love about Chabad and the Lubavitcher Rebbe is they had a very powerful approach, which was you sort of go one mitzvah at a time and you start from where that person is. Since your job is to fight ignorance in Moment, I think this is a message that will resonate with you. But I think it's to overcome ignorance. If you don't know what Israel is, then buy a plane ticket and go to Israel and see for yourself all these horrible things that you're hearing about Israel. And go talk to a lot of people. Talk to people who are Jewish, talk to people who are not Jewish. Really understand the complexity and the nuance of what's going on in that country. If you're somebody whose experience of Judaism is to go to shul twice a year on Rosh Hashanah and Yom Kippur when it's crowded and everybody's rushed and you don't really, you feel like you have to sit there for some amount of time. Do it differently. Go to a Kabbalat Shabbat and a Friday night dinner at your local shul when it's not so crowded, when everything's a little bit more relaxed. Find a place that makes you comfortable. Find something to latch onto that you like and then scratch deeper at it. And you'll be surprised at what you find, and you'll be surprised to talk to people within the Jewish community. So my advice is just a little bit at a time. Find something in the new year that gets you a little bit closer. And for all those parents who are concerned that their kids have kind of gone off the derech, way further than they ever thought, the advice that I give is worry a little bit less about them and what you tell them and worry more about what you do. If you are a Jewish woman and you're worried that your kids are now hating Israel, or they're intermarrying with no thought of getting the partner to convert, or they're not sure if they're going to have their children be Jewish, what you can do is start lighting Shabbat candles. Your kids will pay more attention at any age to what you do as a parent than what you tell them. Be more concerned with your own journey, and they will be inspired by it if it's a journey that you find inspiring.
I know this is an impossible question, but I'm going to ask it anyways. But what would your dad be saying right now in this particular moment in 2026, 2025, excuse me, where there's so much anti-Semitism and there's so much rethinking of the previous world order and changing? What do you think that he would be telling you?
So, first of all, I tend to not respond directly to questions like that. I think that this is going to sound bad, but there are very few privileges to being dead. One of them should be not having words put in your mouth. My father left us a very full corpus of text of what he believes, his speeches, his why lectures. There's all of that. So we all can explore that together and draw our own conclusions and quote him as needed. What I learned from my father that I do think I can share is what I like to call his oral Torah. In Judaism, there's the Torah shebichtav, there's the Torah that's in writing, and then there's the oral Torah, the Torah shebe'al peh, that which was learned by oral tradition. And my father, his oral tradition was the way he treated people. He led with questions, and they were open-ended questions, not leading questions. He truly wanted to understand why somebody was thinking the way they were, what they were thinking, what their background was, whether you were a cab driver from Bangladesh or the head of state of France. He had equal interest in hearing a story. And I think that that's really the learning that maybe we need more than ever, is the ability to ask that open-ended question and engage with people rather than immediately get into fight mode and do that.
I think you and I are saying exactly the same thing, because that's what I'm trying to do with Moment, is keep us out of fight mode and keep us in listening mode and understanding mode. I think that's very much this. Thank you for bringing that back to that for us. One of the things that whenever I take a Lyft, Uber, cab, for a few years after your dad died, I would ask them if they knew who your dad was. And 99% had never heard of your dad. And I feel like there's a huge audience right there in Lyft drivers and Uber drivers who need to learn about your dad. We have to
So what needs to be on the Elie Wiesel podcast to get them there?
Well, let's brainstorm about that. And we have to make sure that podcast is available for them. But it's a really important part of our American society are the people driving Lyfts and Ubers and cabs, and they come from all over the world. And there's got to be some way and often from the Middle East. And I just feel, anyways, it's just something I think about a lot. So we'll have to brainstorm about that. Well, do you have any last question for me?
I sure do.
Okay, I'll see if I'm going to answer it.
If Charlie Kirk had wanted to write a piece for Moment, would you have embraced it?
It depends really on the piece. I
Okay.
have that if he had written a piece that was, um, a thoughtful piece that brought us to a reader to some place where they would have a greater understanding of his perspective or of the world in some way, then yes. If he just wrote a piece that was angry or was meaningless, as far as we could, and it's not just me, um, the answer is no. So, and I can't also say that, yes, that I was paying such a great amount of attention to Charlie Kirk.
I didn't know who he was before he died, so like, I'm still learning.
So like I wasn't reading, I mean, I don't even know, I didn't read his work, so I can't judge it, but I can say that we've had, you know, I've interviewed and had conversations with people I personally completely disagree with, but they don't need to even know that because my job is to learn about what they're trying to understand where they're coming from. And to see, and sometimes, I'll have conversations with people or we'll interview someone and we'll discover that there is this little area where we actually agree. And that little area where we agree is hugely important. And that can lead to, building a connection. And those connections are what combats anti-Semitism and combats all kinds of prejudice. And that's so important. So the answer is yes. If it had been a meaningful piece, yes.
First of all, thank you for the answer. I really appreciate the way in which you guided me with a very firm hand when you didn't want to hear my questions, and yet left space for at the end of our conversation because you knew I had a question pending. My quick comment on what you were just saying is yes, I think that the space that we can find in common often has to do with that we sequence our priorities differently. But if we go through the whole list of priorities, we actually discover that there's quite a lot in common. We just might have them in a different order, whether it's free speech or the sanctity of the family or the importance of education. A lot of these things might be in different orders for people, but if you go through the whole list, just seeing that they're all on there can be a pretty important step in healing some of this divide.
And what it takes is a long conversation. Sometimes it's, you know, you might really need to talk to someone for a few hours or a series of conversations before you can figure that out and even become self-aware enough about what you're thinking and then understand what they're thinking. So it's not something that happens on social media. It's not something that happens, in 5 minutes or 15 minutes, but it does mean we need to build relationships with people that we might not necessarily, you know, think we agree with.
You know the old Jewish joke about the optimist and the pessimist. The pessimist says, can't get any worse than this, and the optimist says, oh yes, it can. I think about that a little bit. Rome wasn't built in a day, but it wasn't destroyed in a day either. We have a little time to get this right through multiple conversations.
On that note, thank you so much, Elisha. It was
Thank you, Nadine.
very lovely to talk to you today.